Sandy and I had been couch surfing across the cities of Asia for the last 6 months, safe and in the bosom of civilization. After several weeks traveling across Japan, we decided that we wanted to see something other than towns and cities, and we began browsing last-minute tours of the Japanese countryside. Most of them were the sort of tourist destinations that we'd spent our time seeing so far, but none of these caught our eye. We were looking for something way off the beaten track. "This looks perfect," said Sandy, pointing at her phone. "The guide takes you to a lesser-known part of a huge national park, specifically to get away from the crowds. Imagine it, no parking lots jammed with tourist-packed coaches, just us, the guide, and the Japanese wilds." It did sound perfect, but knowing how Sandy often got ahead of herself, I ran a quick search for the reviews, and I couldn't turn anything up. No reviews. "I guess it's a new tour," I said, gesturing to the fruitless search. But she was undeterred. "Well, all the other tours are fully booked or they send us to a soulless tourist trap. So we either roll the dice or we spend a few more days in the city. Besides, we'll have a great time no matter what the tour's like. We always do." She did have a point. Her last-minute impulsiveness had led us on many misadventures, planned or otherwise, and although we had some grim tales to tell, we'd never had a bad time. "Okay, let's do it." I leant over her shoulder and tapped her screen to book the outing. "I knew you'd come around. Now, let's make our last night in the city count. Karaoke time." And with that, Sandy threw her arm over my shoulder and, ignoring my arguments for an early night, forced me out of the hotel door. The next day, I woke up to a horrible hangover and vocal cords which were keen to remind me that my range was a lot smaller than I'd thought the night before. After a hurried breakfast of coffee and painkillers, we were out the door and cramming ourselves into the sardine can that is the rush hour metro. After a 10-minute ride that lasted far longer than it had any right to, we swapped the underground for the blazing heat of the Japanese summer, and we walked the short distance to the tour meeting point, where a friendly native pointed us in the general direction of our guide. I spotted the short Japanese lady wearing a luminous green vest sporting the words Takayasha Tours. Dragging Sandy away from a nearby vending machine, I approached the woman. "Yukiko?" I asked, waving as we walked over. "Hi, you are here for the mountain tour," she replied, a slight Japanese accent clinging to her English. We answered in the affirmative, gave our names, and before we knew it, we were bundling into the back of a minibus with Yukiko sitting up front to drive. On the drive through the city and out into the suburbs, Yukiko proved herself to be an able guide, dropping tidbits of information about the structures and areas we were driving past. Her easy manner and entertaining delivery brought the city to life. Before long, grey was replaced with green as we left the city and headed out into the countryside proper. Even through the window of a speeding vehicle, the countryside of Japan was a sight to behold. In the long journey to the mountains, it seemed to pass in an instant. Finally, Yukiko pulled the car off of the main road onto a dirt track hidden in the shade of the trees at the base of a heavily wooded mountain. A few bumpy moments later, we reached a small clearing in the trees, and Yukiko brought the car to a stop. "Okay, from here we have a small walk to the base of the mountains, following an old Shinto pilgrimage trail. We will pass many old shrines and temples on either side of the path. but it is not allowed for us to approach them. Feel free to take photos if you like, Yukiko told us once we were out of the minibus. The old pilgrimage trail was paved with haphazardly placed grey bricks that seemed to rise up and catch your foot just as you looked away from them to take in the sight of a particularly striking shrine or torii gate. Each turn in the path revealed another charming tableau as the summer sun dabbled the path and set the bronze and red of the temples aglow, holding us enraptured until the uneven footing caught us unaware once more. We carried on down the trail for a while longer until we reached an old bench where Yukiko called a stop for lunch. Whilst we ate, a distant chanting reached us from down the trail. Surprised, Yukiko explained, "These temples are not used very often, and when they are, it is only on certain days. But this is not one of them. Even if it was, we would be lucky to hear a ceremony so deep in the woods." She listened for a few moments more and added, "Though I do not recognize this prayer." We continued along the path towards the rhythmic chanting. Through the tall trees, we could see that the trail was taking us towards the green mountain, and whilst we walked, the sound of rushing water joined the monks' chanting, increasing in volume until we came across a large lake. The mountain loomed across the lake from us, and a number of rapid streams swept down it and over the edge of a colossal boulder set into the face of the mountain, forming a collection of pure white waterfalls that shimmered in the midday sun. The trees huddled close around the lake, and the path led through them, past a large red temple set partly over the water on short round stilts. As we walked towards the temple, the chanting grew in intensity, and the background noise of the forest, it began to fade, almost like a storm was approaching. Sandy and I, we caught each other's eyes apprehensively as the sky began to darken behind the mountain. Yukiko noticed our discomfort and reassured us. This far into the mountains, the weather can change quickly and without warning. But as darkness rapidly spread across the sky from behind the mountain, she seemed less confident. "This doesn't seem like a storm," I worried out loud, and my fears were confirmed as the spreading darkness shrouded the sun, plunging us into an eerie twilight. The sky around the mountain looked like it had been replaced by a starless night, which gave way to the brilliant blue of a spotless sky at its edges. "I vote we head for that temple ASAP, Sandy said, fear in her voice. "Ditto," I replied, equally uncomfortable. Normally, I would not like to intrude a ceremony, but I think the monks will understand because of this, said Yukiko, gesturing to the sky. With that, we hastily made our way towards the temple. The path wound through 3 stone torii gates of increasing size, ending at the black steps which climbed to the front of the temple. The large entrance was shrouded by cream drapes and candlelight flickered through them from inside. The chanting of the monks slipped around the drapes and echoed around the silent lake as though they were standing right next to us. It sent a chill up my spine. It should be okay to enter, but take your shoes off before you go inside, said Yukiko as we ascended the steps. We kicked our shoes off and I pushed through the drapes. I knew something was wrong as soon as my hand breached the threshold. My emotions stilled like the sounds of nature had outside, and a wave of sickening black swept in to replace them, like sewage in a clear pool. As I fully passed through the drapes, the chanting abruptly stopped, leaving not even an echo behind, and the bright candlelight hinted at through the material dimmed and went out, plunging the large space into gloom. An empty husk of a building stood before me, and the floor was strewn with twigs and leaves from the forest, and 3 figures stood in the center of the room, their heads bowed as if in prayer. Jesus Christ, what was that? I heard Sandy whisper as she entered behind me. Did you feel it? It's like the color drained out of the world. She looked around. And what happened to the lights? Shaken, and with no better idea of what had happened myself, I turned to her and simply shrugged. Yukiko approached the closest figure. "Sumima-sen," she croaked, but none of them responded. As I moved in, I could see why. Mottled, grey flesh was visible under the monk's tattered robes, as though it had begun putrefying where it stood, and a swollen tongue lolled out of its cracked lips like a blue slug. At once, the decaying figures began chanting again. But this was not the clear, rhythmic sound from before. The voices that struggled out of their blocked mouths were somewhere between a whimper and a growl, the syllables intoned in unsettling ways. I caught Sandy's panicked eyes, and we both bolted for the exit in unison, Yukiko not far behind. As we passed through the now ruined drapes into the gloom outside, my ears began to ring heavily. "What the hell is going on here?" I said, panic staining my voice as we fled the temple. "I do not know. I do not know," Yukiko yelled back as she ran. Once we had covered what felt like a safe distance from the temple, we slowed down to catch our breath. "Were those guys dead?" Sandy asked, in between panting breaths. I didn't know what to think. It looked that way. And that feeling. Oh. "I do not know what is going on," Yukiko said in a small voice. Sensing her discomfort, Sandy changed the subject. "My ears are ringing, like I've been standing too close to a speaker for the last few hours." "Yours too?" I rubbed my ears, but the sound persisted. The ringing, it continued to increase in intensity, and as we turned a corner, the mountain came back into view. "Wait, the mountain should be behind us. I think we went the wrong way. This way leads us back to the temple," Yukiko piped up as we walked. "We must have gotten turned around when we ran from the temple," Sandy guessed. Our discussion was interrupted when the ringing in our ears became unbearably loud. Grabbing my head, I saw part of the mountain move. My jaw dropped as I realized that it was not part of the mountain at all, but a gigantic figure shrouded in gloom, walking from a dark void that had formed at the center of the dark sky on the other side of the mountain. Is that a person?" I could just about make out Sandy saying over the deafening ringing in my ears. Yukiko said something I couldn't make out, her face turning white as she stared at this huge figure, the look on her face close to awe. "Come on, we have to get out of here," Sandy yelled, snapping us both out of our stupor. Both directions down the path led back to the lake where the massive creature was heading. So, we charged into the trees opposite to us, hoping to put as much distance between us and it as possible. Scratches and falls were our constant companions as we ran full tilt through the barely lit forest. Crashing through bushes and jumping fallen trees, we pushed on until the ringing subsided to a bearable level. Catching her breath, Sandy managed to puff out, "Is everyone okay?" "Just about," I said, between deep breaths. Yukiko responded, "I think so." Once my lungs stopped burning, I turned to Sandy and Yukiko. "Guys, please tell me you have any idea what's going on here. Those monks were dead, but still singing. And I'm fairly sure I just saw a giant skeleton come out of a hole in the sky." I could feel tears welling up as panic began to set in. Sandy stared at me blankly, as though she was just now starting to process what we had seen. And Yukiko, well, she looked like she'd passed through panic and arrived at whatever was on the other side of it. Looking at us, she said slowly, I think that was Kashatakuro, the giant, starving skeleton. In the tales, you can tell it is coming by ringing in your ears. It is summoned from a black hole in the sky. But they were just tales." "Summoned? So someone called that thing here. Why would anyone do that? Who would do that?" I spat, welcoming the anger in place of fear. The change in the tone of conversation shook Sandy out of her fugue. "The monks," she said. Yukiko nodded. "In one story, Kashatakuro is summoned by a spell recital. That would explain why I have never heard that chant at a temple before." "Right. So now we know that there is a Gachadaku, whatever it's called, here. What do we do?" "It's early afternoon. The sun's basically MIA. We're literally lost in the woods, and none of us are even wearing shoes. Yukiko, do you know where we are?" I asked. "I have never left the path before. I'm a guide, not an explorer. If we could see the mountain, I could probably find my way. But the trees, they are too tall here," she replied, looking at the towering conifers that surrounded us, compounding the gloom of the artificial twilight. "I've got an idea," Sandy said, apprehensively, as though she wished she didn't. "We could follow the ringing to a landmark we recognize." "That landmark might be a 100-foot tall skeleton or a temple full of zombie monks," I shot back, more anger in my voice than I intended. "I know that, but our only other option is to wander in the forest, in the dark, with that thing out there somewhere." "She is right," Yukiko agreed. "It gets cold in the mountains at night. None of us are wearing the proper clothes. If we stay out here too long, I do not think we would make it through the night." "I guess that settles it then," I admitted. "I doubt we ran in a straight line, but heading back the way we came is a better start than picking a direction at random," I thought aloud. "Agreed," said Sandy, as Yukiko nodded. Sticking close together, we turned around and began walking back the way we came, simultaneously hopeful and terrified that we would hear that head-splitting ringing again. A funny thing happens when you listen intently with next to no background noise. Most people will find that their ears start ringing due to some kind of ear damage caused by one or more short-sighted decisions in their past. We weren't sure if we were mistaking this for the ringing of the giant, and though we tried to retrace our steps, in the gloom with no equipment, it was proving extremely difficult. We were beginning to lose hope when an enormous crash resounded through the forest, loud enough for nearby trees to shake. "What in the hell was that?" Sandy asked. Startled, I replied, "I have no idea." We stood in silence, facing the direction of the boom, straining our ears for any further clues. Sandy volunteered, "I bet the skeleton had something to do with it. It's risky, but we should head in that direction and hope we come across a landmark." With a clear goal in mind, we redoubled our efforts, and I felt hope bloom in my chest as the trees started to thin out and we could once again see the mountain. "Okay, we need to head that way," Yukiko said, pointing towards the mountain and taking the lead. The forest was becoming darker as we marched towards the mountain. Sandy sighed with relief when the trees suddenly gave way to the edge of the lake. From that side of the lake, we should have seen waterfalls falling over the huge boulder embedded in the mountainside. My eyes widened when I saw that the boulder had been tossed to one side and the waters were falling into a gaping black hole in its place. Even in the gloom, we could see a grey fog was spreading outwards from the dark pit, draining the colour from the surroundings. Where the monochrome fog touched, plant life became desiccated, and the clear blue lake water was replaced by a bog-like mess. "Yomi," I heard Yukiko utter fearfully. The three of us stood there, exhausted and gazing at the strange scene as our tired minds tried to process it. Looking at the grey fog, it filled me with an almost primal dread and a strange sense of familiarity, as though my body instinctively recognized it for what it was. The feeling of dread, it deepened when the ringing returned full force and something massive began rising from the deep shadow in the hole. The dim light from the shrouded sun bounced off an enormous mottled grey skull as the Gashorakoro stepped out into the boggy lake. It looked in our direction, and the empty sockets seemed to burn into us. "Not again," I said, my voice breaking with fear as I turned to run back into the woods with Sandy at my side. The ringing, it was becoming louder as we ran, and I pulled from the reserves I didn't know I had to speed up into a full tilt sprint. Branches whipped at my face, and the forest floor tore into my socked feet, but I could barely feel it as terror drove me onward like a frenzied animal. "Where's Yukiko?" Sandy screamed over the ear-splitting tone. Using all my willpower, I stopped and turned to look through the trees. She had tripped, and the Gashorakoro was almost on top of her. "Yukiko, run, now!" I shouted at the top of my lungs. But Yukiko was frozen in place, clutching her head as streams of dark blood trickled from her ears, seemingly unaware of the giant looming over her. The ringing, still loud in our ears, we watched in horror as the Gashorakoro reached for her from the lake, its bony fingers wrapping around her legs and torso to hold her in a massive, skeletal fist. As the giant fingers closed around her body, she realized what was happening and began to scream so loudly that we could hear it even over the infernal ringing. The hulking skeleton slowly lifted Yukiko until her head was level with its enormous skeletal grin. Each tooth in its mouth the size of a pillow, and its jaw began to open. Yukiko thrashed in the giant's grip, but to no avail, and in slow motion we watched those massive teeth slam shut around her neck. Its jaw clamped shut as it began wrenching the body away. My mind froze in shock, and I wondered how long it took before a severed head lost consciousness. I prayed to whatever gods were listening that Yukiko's last moments were not spent witnessing her grisly fate from the inside of the giant's mouth. Dropping Yukiko's body in the lake like a broken doll, this thing stepped onto the lake's shore, moving its head from side to side, as though it was searching for us. Knowing that there was no way we could outrun it, we hoped that the skeleton could not see us through the dim light. As we waited, frozen in a terrified silence, the grey fog continued to spread slowly from the gaping maw behind the monster. The fog reached the shore, and we saw something jerkily rise from its gloomy depths. Yukiko's monochrome, headless body pierced the top of the murk in fits and starts. Her formerly vibrant clothes stretched over her bloated body like stained grey rags, and the slimy chunks of skin visible through them hung from her in places as though she had been under the lake's surface for years. The headless corpse swayed there, facing the shore like it was waiting for something. The fog continued to advance past it, washing the life and colour out of everything it touched and deepening the shadows it passed over. Terrified of the prospect of the fog reaching and corrupting us as it had every other thing it touched, I mouthed to Sandy, "We need to go." Her wide eyes met my own, and she nodded shakily. We moved as slowly and as silently as our present state would allow, creeping further into the forest, using the mountain to keep us on track. We inched along painfully for what felt like hours, under the constant threat of the slowly dimming ringing, occasionally catching glimpses of the headless corpse and Gashadokuro standing guard on the shore. Eventually, we moved far enough away that we risked increasing our pace. When the ringing continued to decrease, we moved as fast as possible in the direction we thought the old pilgrimage path was, and after a grueling, hour-long trek, finally, we found it. Exhausted, we made our way back to the road and we flagged down a local for help. Back once more in civilization, Sandy and I concocted a more believable version of our story, and we presented it to the local police to explain Yukiko's disappearance, telling them that we had become separated from her in the woods when the weather became extreme. The police let us go, and we returned to our hotel room, where we slept away the horrors of the day. Sandy will not talk about what happened, but I have not been able to stop thinking about it. The last thing we heard Yukiko say was Yomi. I've since learned that this is the name for the Shinto underworld, and it was supposedly connected to our world before being sealed off with a boulder by an ancient god. I've been watching a lot of TV whilst we recover, and I've seen what looks like local news reports of a strange fog spreading around the area we visited. With the portal open and no gods to be seen, who will save us from the fury of the dead this time?